I'm from the psychology department here in Tel Aviv, and my lab studies perceptions, actions, volition, and everything in between. So we also have some studies on learning that I hope to show you here. And we're interested in basically the sensory motor loop and the interactions between action and perception. And you're probably familiar with the concept of mirror neurons. These are cells in the motor cortex that have been shown to respond to percepts, to visual or auditory percepts of actions performed by others. And these neurons, originally in the ventral premotor cortex of the monkey and also in parietal cortex, have now been shown in monkeys, in marmosets, in songbirds. So they're pretty prevalent across species. And if you're wondering what happens in humans, so also in humans using invasive recordings in supplementary motor area, but also in regions of the temporal lobe, we found neurons that respond both when human participants observe actions performed by others, but also perform these actions themselves. And using more traditional non-invasive techniques like functional MRI. So when people observe actions performed by others, then we see activity not only in visual regions, but also in parietal and premotor regions. When we examined whether there are differences when people observe right-hand movements or left-hand movements that you see here, in our case, we see a large overlap, but no real distinction or no significant distinction when people observe right versus left-hand movements, and I'll get to that later. The flip side of from percepts to your motor cortex and to actions is what happens when we perform actions and how do they influence neural activity in sensory regions. So it has been shown across multiple species from crickets all the way to bats and monkeys and electric fish that when I perform an action, then there's modulation of my sensory cortex to the extent that if I hear a sound that was produced by someone else, or if I produce exactly the same sound, my auditory cortex responds differently, and usually it responds in an attenuated manner, such that if someone else performed the action and I hear the sound, I'll get a large response. But if I press the button and generated exactly the same sound, we're talking about auditory cortex. So in principle, it should be agnostic to who performed the action or the sound, right? But nevertheless, we see that the self-generated sensory consequences are attenuated, at least their response. This has been shown in auditory cortex, in visual cortex, and like I said, in multiple species. And also in humans. So if we take the example of auditory cortex, and we look at the EEG response, then the EEG response to self-generated sounds is lower compared to exactly the same sound, but simply produced by someone else. So these are neural correlates, and there are also perceptual correlates. Perhaps you're familiar with the fact that you cannot tickle yourself. Okay, so your self-generated actions or the sensory aspects are attenuated. And predominant model trying to explain these phenomena suggest that during active performance with sensory consequences, then the motor cortex, in addition to sending the motor commands, also sends predictive signals to the relevant sensory cortex, let's say in this case, auditory cortex, and it changes the state in this region. So when the feedback reaches auditory cortex, the response is different compared to an external condition where there's no engagement. Okay. But, and like I said, this is a prevalent model, but there are some things that are missing. And one thing that we found missing in this model, first, we don't know exactly what is this motor pathway that sends the signals, whether it's SMA or cerebellum or any other motor region or basal ganglia. And the other thing is the model is agnostic to the fact that motor and sensory regions have a strong, or we can discuss, lateral bias. Okay, so in the visual modality, right, if I have stimuli in the right visual field, they will be processed in my left visual cortex, and vice versa for the left visual field. This is also true in auditory cortex, maybe less strong than in visual cortex, but still, if you compare right ear stimulation to left ear stimulation, you get this strong bias of the right ear going to the left auditory cortex and the left ear going to the right auditory cortex. And of course, motor cortex, we also see this strong lateral bias for the two hands. So in a study we did, we tried to examine whether these motor-induced modulations on sensory cortices are hand-dependent, okay, and compare active versus passive perception of sounds. And what we see is that these were healthy participants inside the scanner playing an MR-compatible digital piano. And they played these short sequences that we could record, and we could replay these same sequences so that we have an active condition and a passive condition. And what we see is that in auditory cortex, despite the fact that the stimulation is identical, we see stronger activity for the active condition. But more interestingly, we see that these activations are hand-dependent. So in left auditory cortex, we see stronger signals when the subjects play the piano with the right hand compared to when they played with their left hand, and vice versa for the right auditory cortex. So suggesting that connections between motor cortex and auditory cortex on the same side enhance the signal amplitude. We also did a behavioral study, and we found that we examined the hearing thresholds for each ear separately. And we find that when you generate sounds with your right hand compared to the left, then the hearing thresholds of your right ear are lower, meaning that you hear better with your right ear and your right hand, compared to the condition. So this would be the IPSI lateral condition, compared to when you generate the same sounds. Okay, you try to converge to the hearing threshold, but now just pressing the button with your left hand, then your hearing thresholds in the right ear will be a bit higher. Dominantית של יד או של... So these were all right-handed participants.
Is this result prediction with the previous one method, or is
In what sense? The MRI result.
the MRI result?
The MRI result, the direction of the MRI result is opposite of the EEG result. Yes. This could be differences in the techniques, right, in the modality, but this is something we see consistently. We also performed a MEG study, and we found, again, here it was a different question, but the subjects pressed buttons, and only 500 milliseconds later, we gave them the sound. And what we see is action-locked activity in the auditory cortex that's contralateral to the active hand. So they pressed the button with the right hand, and 500 milliseconds there was a sound. And we see in auditory cortex, in left auditory cortex, this action-locked signal of the MEG signal. So this is not specific to auditory cortex. We find this also in visual cortex. So visual cortex, we can also manipulate the stimulated cortex by just changing the location of the stimulus. And in principle, if you press a button to generate this stimulus, visual cortex should be agnostic if you generated it with the right hand or with the left hand. But these modulations, the source of these modulations, we believe, will be different because when you press with the right hand, you engage your left motor cortex. And when you use your left hand, you engage your right motor cortex. So the input should cross the hemisphere, and perhaps it will be different. And indeed, that is what we found, but they're from the lab. Using decoding, we can use activation patterns in visual cortex. So in all cases, the visual stimulus is the same. But yet, in visual cortex, we see different patterns of activity depending on the hand that was used to generate the stimulus. So we see evidence for motor evoked activity in auditory cortex, also in visual cortex. We see that it is contralateral to the active hand, and that it corresponds with increased perception. Okay? So how does this all fit into learning? We see that we add to the model some issue of laterality, but now we want to examine this in the context of learning. And our thinking is that, let's say I'm playing with my left hand, okay? So it engages my right motor cortex. So these efference copies, if we look at the forward model, because of stronger connections within hemispheres, will show stronger modulations for the right auditory cortex compared to the left. That's our working hypothesis. So in this behavioral study, what we did is we had participants trained on a sequence, like a short melody of 8 notes. And what they had to do is learn to perform the sequence exactly at specific timings. So exactly 300 milliseconds between the different sequences. And what we manipulated is the hand in the ear. So we had 4 groups of 30 participants in each group. And they trained for 2 days on performing this task. Right? So we had a right hand, right ear, right hand, left ear, left hand, right ear, left hand, left ear groups. And they trained on this for 2 days. So they had a metronome during training. And between 2 beats of the metronome, they had to perform the sequence. So that was their feedback during learning. And after training, we assess their performance or their accuracy. So we basically look at, you can think of it as a measure of variability or deviance from the perfect performance, which is 300 milliseconds. We basically take the absolute distance from the perfect interval, right? So larger numbers correspond to larger errors. And what you see here is the condition for the left hand ipsilateral. So it's left hand. This is the group that trained with the left hand and the left ear. Okay. So first we can see that they improve across days and in general across blocks, right? So like I said, lower numbers correspond to better performance. And this is the left hand, left ear. And if we compare this to the group that was left hand, right ear, we see that they reach better performance. These are all right hand.
Experiences playing piano or not?
No, no. These are students. We exclude those that have several years of experience. So this is for the left hand. And we also did this, of course, for the right hand group. And again, we can see significant learning. You can see even offline gains. So the first 20 blocks were on day 1, the last 20 blocks were on day 2. And if we, so here, right hand ipsilateral, so this is right hand, right ear. Okay. And we compare this to the right hand, left ear. And we see that the right hand, left ear, at least on the second day, is better. So it seems that the contralateral configuration between the motor cortex and the auditory cortex, in this case, yields better performance. Okay. What about transfer? So if I trained with the right hand in a specific configuration, will this transfer to my left hand that hasn't trained? So this is the performance before. There's no significant difference, but at least for the left hand, okay, if I train to the left hand, the contralateral group, which also performed better, transferred better to the right. So the question is whether we can exploit these types of manipulations and look at the configural relationships between motor circuits and sensory circuits to improve or to facilitate learning and rehabilitation. So this is from a study we did a while ago. Using a virtual reality setup with motion sensitive gloves and head mount display, where basically we have healthy participants train on a sequence of movements. And here what we manipulate is their visual feedback. So basically they train with the right hand, but through the goggles, what they see is their left virtual hand performing the task. So you'll see this in a second. So this is what she sees through the goggles. And during the experiment, they put their hands under the table so they don't see the actual hands and they only see the virtual hands placed at the correct position. And whenever they move the right hand, they receive feedback of the left virtual hand performing the same task. Okay, so this is one type of manipulation that we can do. And another type of manipulation that we did was with physical or mechanical movement. So basically, their hands are strapped to this device, and only one hand can operate the device. And whenever they move with, let's say, the right hand, it yokes the relevant fingers of the left hand, and we can manipulate the visual feedback as we wish. And doing these types of manipulation, what we find is that our measure is for the left hand that never trained. Okay? It was either yoked or only received visual feedback, but it never physically or voluntarily trained. And what we see is the best change in performance. So this is within session, this same day. And we had different conditions, either only observation of the right hand or movement of the right hand and perception of the left hand. So this is the condition I showed earlier. But when we add this passive movement device, we see the best results. And together with Nahum at Beth Levenstein and Sylvie, we examined this in a case study with a patient with Hemi-Parkinson. So he trained for 2 weeks using this device. He performed the finger sequences with the mechanical device. So in his case, it was opposite. So his less affected hand was the left hand, and the more affected hand was the right hand. So we have to switch the device and the visual accordingly. And across, we had 9 days instead of 10 because we had some glitch, but we see a steady improvement in his performance of the task. And at the neural level, we see increased functional connectivity during resting. This is the before and the after. So perhaps by engaging circuits, motor circuits and sensory circuits that are from opposite hemispheres, we can enhance the integration, okay, and facilitate learning of this type of simple motor task. And now what we're doing is trying to use much simpler tasks and in clinical populations where we know, suspect that this asymmetry or the bias between hemispheres different. So for instance, in ASD, there are reports of a more balanced activity or less biased activity across hemispheres, or in Parkinson's or stroke, where one side is strongly affected, and by manipulating the input monaural versus binaural or ipsilateral or ipsilesional, we are using either synchronization tasks or generation tasks, and we are examining the force profile of tapping. Okay, and so far, preliminary results suggest that indeed the force profiles are different for ipsilateral versus contralateral feedback, but these are the things that we are now exploring. So with this, I'll thank the lab members. And this is what I saw this morning when I took the train. So with the hostages and the situation and everything and the downers, so I thought maybe I'll bring some hope.
I want to recap a little, to take some conclusions, maybe ideas. Lecture, you say that from the work there is significant motor learning. You can see it among individuals. So you can see it when you use the different paradigms, and from the patient with the Hemi-Parkinson, would you suggest that the process was more similar to the motor learning, to the findings that demonstrating the suggestive of motor learning? What do you think you can I think our next goals, our next steps would be to improve motor recovery. We understand that motor learning has something to do with it in facilitating, but in what exact way? Your lecture is more like more than compensation, more going into the restitution part. So what do you think about that?
We're trying to find the optimal or alternative pathways for sensory motor integration. That's why we're trying to manipulate the sides, and we're examining whether within hemisphere or cross hemisphere connections facilitate better. In terms of the process that happened with the patient, so we also, I didn't show it, but we had also the fMRI where we see increased activity in his motor cortex following training. If I remember correctly, it was on the non-training side, like his right hand, so it's the left motor cortex. Okay? If it's recovery or compensation or that I don't know. Yeah.
I have a question about the first part of your talk. So you mentioned that this motor evoked responses in the auditory cortex.
Yeah.
So did you also examine the opposite effect? Like, is there any direction effect here? Like, if you train participants to hear first and then to press the button, did you see similar idea that auditory response in the motor cortex?
Okay.
So is there a direction?
I thought you were asking if there's an order effect.
No,
there's no order effect. In terms of you first generate and then perceive or vice versa. But you're asking something else, whether in motor cortex you see predictive signals of the upcoming stimulus. And the answer is yes. So if I look at your motor cortex, so the answer is at two levels. Okay, if I look at the neural level, at your motor cortex, and I compare conditions where you just press a button versus you press a button and you hear a sound. Okay, we see in motor cortex difference in the activation level. Okay, stronger activity for the silent condition compared to the generative condition. Okay, that's one level. The other level is more at a kinetic level. So if I look at your force profile for silent button presses versus button presses that generate sounds, we see a strong difference, not only us, it's reported, but we see it also in our lab. So when you generate a sound, your force profile will be smaller, will be attenuated. You apply less force compared to a silent condition where, so in that sense, if I see differences in activity in motor cortex, I need to control for differences in the kinetics. I suspect that the differences in kinetics are too small to generate the big differences you see in the brain, but it's something that needs to be accounted for.
The subject like perceive that they're hearing something, this is before they actually hear the sound, but you see this kind of like increased activation in this third cortex. Do they report that they something they are hearing? This is so there could be one explanation that they hear something before actually they hear the sound, or they perceive that they are hearing because they press the button.
Even in the silent condition.
Yeah.
So we usually try to start with a non-contingent condition where there's no association. Sometimes we even separate it by days just to make sure. And we keep the associated conditions, like the button plus sound, later because we don't want some implicit expectations